Hello and welcome to First Luke, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're going to be thinking about a very dramatic episode in John's Gospel in which Jesus overturned the tables in the temple. But before we do that, if you haven't done so already, you might find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this Bible study. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find the link for that just below the video. On the sheet, you will find the text of the reading that we're going to be looking at, the Bible study questions that we'll come to later on, some other suggested passages that you might wish to look up, and plenty of space for you to make your own notes. So without further ado, let's dive into today's reading, which comes from John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22. This is a really powerful passage in the Gospel of John, and it follows on from the wedding at Cana in Galilee, where Jesus turned a vast amount of water into really fantastic wine. That story, as the first of the signs and wonders that Jesus performed, was programmatic for the rest of the Gospel. In other words, it lays out some of the key themes and key ideas and motifs that will come up again and again and again throughout John's Gospel. Today's passage, picking up from that, has a similar kind of function. It sets the tone for an awful lot of what follows, and we'll unpack why that is as we go through. The context is that we are in the time period of the Passover festival. This was a festival in which the people of Israel remembered being brought out from oppression and captivity in Egypt into eventual freedom by God via 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And as part of the celebrations of that, going back to the very first Passover, it involved the sacrifice of a spotless lamb. That was a key part of the ritual of remembering what God had done for the people. It was the custom for every Jewish man who was physically able to do so to go to Jerusalem on pilgrimage for this festival. And so that's why we find Jesus travelling from Galilee to Jerusalem for Passover. And it's in Jerusalem, and specifically in the temple and its courtyard, that the action takes place. The temple had been under reconstruction for a long time. We're told 46 years prior to this particular incident. The work was begun by Herod the Great and finished off by one of his sons. And it was a monumental structure. You might recall there are times when Jesus is with his disciples on the Mount of Olives looking down towards the temple, and they remark on the huge stones and the impressiveness of the structure. The scale of it was massive. It's hard to understate. And as well as being physically, architecturally significant, it was profoundly symbolically significant and central to Israel's national life. I think in a way that's hard for us to get our head round in a more secular kind of context. It was the place of worship and music and politics and society, of celebration and of mourning. And more significantly, it was the place where God had promised to dwell with the people in the Holy of Holies, the place where God would be with them. I think the closest we can get to it nowadays is probably somewhere like Westminster Abbey, which is very central to our national civic life. But it was much deeper than that. It really was the focal point of Israel's national identity. And so Jesus is, at this stage, an unknown prophet from Galilee coming into the centre of Israel's national life, bringing with him at least some of the disciples. We know he was with Simon and Andrew and Philip and Nathanael and one other unnamed disciple at the least by that point. And he encountered what some translations call the Judeans, others the Jews, meaning the religious leaders of the people of Israel. They didn't like what Jesus was doing and questioned him about his behaviour. This comes in the fourth and final of the Gospels to be written. We begin with Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then end with John. And that was written probably about 90 to 95 AD, that kind of point in time. And it's interesting, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, differ very sharply from John in various instances. And we really see that today in this account. Before we delve into it, it's worth keeping in mind that there's a particular Old Testament text that we need to draw on here to make sense of what's going on. And that's specifically Psalm 69, verse 9. It's quoted in verse 17 of our passage, when the disciples find it comes to their minds as they think about what Jesus is doing in that temple courtyard. And it's about righteous suffering and about a zeal for God's house and God's people. And I'll say more about that later on. It's also helpful to compare and contrast this version of the story with the earlier ones that we find in Mark and Matthew and Luke. So specifically in Mark 11, 15 to 19, Matthew 21, verses 12 to 17, and Luke 19, verses 45 to 48. Now, as I've already hinted at, there are significant differences between the account of this story that John gives us and what we find in the Synoptic Gospels. One of the most striking is the place that it comes within the story. For Mark and Matthew and Luke, it occurs within the story of Holy Week. It happens just after Jesus has arrived into Jerusalem in triumph on Palm Sunday. Whereas for John, it's right at the beginning of the Gospel, and it's Jesus' inaugural action in Jerusalem. So that is a key difference, and I'll say a bit more about that momentarily. John misses out some of the detail that we do find in the earlier accounts. So he doesn't mention the need for the temple to be a house of prayer for all nations, for example, and misses out some of the material that we find on prayer in Mark's account. There are differing explanations as to why John has put this story at the beginning of his Gospel rather than integrating it into an account of Holy Week. For Tom Wright, the synoptics place the story in Holy Week because they only have Jesus visiting Jerusalem the once. Whereas in John's Gospel, the pattern is very different. Jesus seems to go back and forward between Galilee and Jerusalem. So there's scope to put this incident in a different place. And for Wright, it makes sense because we know from Mark's Gospel that people came from Jerusalem to Galilee to find out what Jesus was up to, and they were already hostile to him. So we see that in Mark 3, verse 22 and verse 1 of chapter 7, for instance. And it also makes sense of why when the high priest, Caiaphas, in John's Gospel, in chapter 11, decides that it's important to act against Jesus and better for one person to die for the sake of the nation, that they've got a case against Jesus if he'd already done this. So that's one way to look at it. Others say, well, maybe Jesus did this more than once. Maybe he did it in the early stages of his ministry and repeated it again 2 or 3 years down the line. It is possible. We can't be certain for sure. But we do know, I think, as I hinted at earlier, that just as the wedding at Cana is an event that shapes so much of what follows in John's Gospel, so is this event for John. It lays out so many of the key themes that come out as we journey through. Now, Passover, as I've already said, was a festival of liberation for the people of Israel and recalled God setting them free. And it's striking that in verse 29 of chapter 1 of this Gospel, Jesus was called the Lamb of God by his older cousin, John the Baptist. And it hints at very early on that Jesus is going to give new meaning to Passover. It's also very telling that John's Gospel is the only one that has Jesus being crucified, has the events of Good Friday taking place at the point of Passover. So there's lots of signals that this is going to be significant. John also mentions two other instances of Passover. In chapter 6, where we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and chapter 12, where we have Jesus being anointed, ready for his death. And put together, they show that Passover was really significant for Jesus and that he was renewing its meaning. It's clear from verses 14 to 16 that Jesus regarded the temple as corrupt, as being under the judgment of God. Some argue that he was challenging the sacrificial system prior to inaugurating some new festivals and feasts of his own. So if we look in chapter 6, for example, we see one of the key texts that we might draw on to explain the origins of the Eucharist, about body and blood and bread and wine. And arguably Jesus was founding a new kingdom community. Actually, I don't think we would argue with that. Jesus was founding a new kingdom community. And some argue that what Jesus was doing in the temple was the first stage of that founding process, if I can put it like that. I think there are difficulties with an account that sort of seems to say Jesus was basically saying, well, we don't really need Judaism anymore. And one of the things that is a real issue in the life of the church and has been down the centuries is how we relate to our Jewish siblings and don't fall into the trap of assuming that God has nothing more to do with the Jewish people. So we do need to be careful in how we interpret the text, but there does seem to be something about challenging the temple and the way it works. Now, as I've said, the quotation that we find in verse 17 comes from Psalm 69, verse 9. Psalm 69 is one of those psalms traditionally attributed to King David, who was the greatest king of Israel. And if we look at the little section in verses 7 through to 12, they point to a concern for God's temple and for God's people. And it's a concern that's all-consuming, quite literally to the point of death, as well as figuratively in terms of being passionate about this. It's a psalm that also sees the psalmist suffering righteously because of their passion, and they look to God for help. We find that in verses 13 onwards. Now we know that earlier on in chapter 1 of John's Gospel, Jesus has already been identified as the Messiah, verse 41, and the Son of God and King of Israel in verse 49. So it makes some sense that this psalm, that is a messianic psalm, would have popped into the minds of the disciples. And it certainly fits with Jewish expectation that the Messiah would be one who would purge and reconstitute the temple. Jesus is identified very clearly, therefore, as Israel's Messiah, but also as one who would suffer righteously. And we might bring Isaiah's suffering servant into the conversation at this point as well. So it's drawing us into some understanding, more deeper understanding of who Jesus is. In verse 18, those people who are sceptical about who he is ask for a sign, ask for evidence, I suppose, of who on earth he thinks he is and what he thinks he's doing. And his response in verses 19 to 22 is one of those instances where there are double meanings of which John is so fond. That points to his death and resurrection. Now that's significant when we're thinking about Jesus and Passover, because as I say, Good Friday is the occasion of Passover for John. So there's a bringing it all together and drawing together these strands of Passover and Jesus as the Divinic Messiah, and also Jesus as the kind of suffering servant figure. And they all come together. But the hearers, as is so often the case in John's Gospel, take Jesus far too literally and miss the point of what he's saying. So if we read on to chapter 3, for example, in the story of Nicodemus, we find yet another example of taking it too literally, not getting it. And there's a bit of that in chapter 4 as well, in Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. Jesus is body is the temple of God, we're told in verse 21. And I think that makes sense when we think back to that famous verse, chapter 1, verse 14, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So there's so much going on with this passage, and I hope you find the questions draw some of those things out for you.